Hello everybody, Pastor Scott from Cornerstone. We've had a lot of great stories that are worth remembering this summer. And this past week we looked at Numbers 21 and the Israelites grumbling in the desert and God's justice on display. And God's justice is never easy to see, but when we see God's justice in the form of snakes going among the people and biting them, it causes us to reflect on our own lack of obedience toward God and the ways we grumble, even though we have all sorts of things that are blessings in our lives. Well, the grumblers in the desert faced a certain death because of the snake bites, not having any way to treat them. But God created a plan, right, that Moses followed, where a bronze serpent was lifted up on a pole, and everyone who looked at that pole then could live. And it was that reminder for us, as Jesus then would explain, that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man would be lifted up. And so, of course, we have the cross on the hill here in Fishers, and that reminder that the Son of Man was lifted up for us, that was God's way, right? And both last week and this week, we're seeing God's way on display. And remembering that God's way is always right, that God's way does what He says it will, and that God's way ultimately is for our own good. And so we are reminded not only that Jesus died for us, but that God continues to provide for us each day. So this week, I'm standing here in front of the wall in Fishers. We're looking at the Battle of Jericho, well, the so-called Battle of Jericho. And as God calls Joshua to lead the people through the Israelites, as God calls Joshua to lead the Israelite people into victory, He does it in a very specific way. Remember walking around the walls of Jericho, and then that last day, that fateful day, not only having them walk around 7 times, but this time at the sound of the ram's horn, to scream at the top of their lungs with a war shout. And the reason why? Well, Joshua tells them, because the Lord told him, "Shout, for the Lord has given you this city." And that declaration, even before it happened, the Lord has given you this city. So I could stand here and I could shout at the wall all day, and the wall's not going to fall down, because that's not God's plan. That's not God's provision for me. And yet I'm reminded, if we put these stories together, if we're reminded of how Scripture speaks to us today, we're reminded that God still provides in ways that are not our own, that God still provides through the cross, and that God overcomes all the walls and obstacles in our lives, especially those walls of sin and of death and of the power of the devil. Knowing that Jesus has overcome, given us the victory, means that we, in turn, are victorious. And so we follow God's plan, we follow God's way, knowing that even though it seems peculiar at times to the world, that it's God's way for us, and that God's plan is always right. So I look forward to seeing you this week in worship. I pray that God will bless your day and the rest of your week.